Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 57, Euthyphro 12a to c. Socrates has just suggested that the just is the holy, or at least part of the holy, and Euthyphro doesn't understand what he means. So Socrates helpfully explains that he means the opposite of what the poet says. When Greeks quote the poet, they are usually referring to Homer, and this may be the case here as well. This poet is actually Stasinus, who composed poems related to the Trojan War, so he could easily be confused with Homer. But there's one thing which shows that this is not part of the Homeric tradition as such, and that is that he's writing not in hexameter, which means 6 feet, but in elegiac couplets, which is one line of hexameter and then one line of pentameter made up of 2.5 feet. It makes 5 feet. So elegiac verse goes 6 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, 5 feet, and so on. The epic oral tradition in hexameter had been going for about 1,000 years, down till about 750 to 700, and the elegiac couplet is a new form which started around the 8th century. We don't know for sure, but it's certainly later than most of the Homeric tradition as such, the oral tradition. You're going to get an example of an elegiac couplet, whether you like it or not, because this is the next thing Socrates says. He quotes from memory. Obviously, Plato himself, who wrote the dialogue, may just have copied it from somewhere, but Socrates in the dialogue has to be accepted as someone with a good memory. So here's the quote. Zene teton erxanta kai hosta depante futiusen u kethelene hinagardeos entha kai eidos. He doesn't want to compete with Zeus, who made all these things and who produced all these things. 4. Where there is apprehension, there is also eidos. And we have to explain what eidos is. People learning ancient Greek are usually given 2 meanings for this word, shame and reverence. But you have to wonder why there is only one word for 2 concepts. It's because there is an underlying concept, for which reason there are these 2 senses. What causes reverence and shame? A sense that one is worse than somebody else, or that somebody else is better than oneself. When I feel bad compared to someone else, I feel shame. But when I look at the bright side that someone else is better than I am, I feel reverence. This is the sort of emotion one has when faced with an authority figure, normally a parent or a god. So we can say reverence, but it's also shame. I should say something about the other term as well. I translated deos as apprehension, but some people translate it as fear. But fear is phobos. And we have, say, Herodotus, who does make the distinction between deos and phobos. Phobos is fear, deos is the sense of impending badness. Something is going to go wrong. This is apprehension. If you think about competing with Zeus, you would know that something would go wrong. For example, you would be punished severely, and you would have this apprehension because you are aware that you are much worse than Zeus, or Zeus is much better than you are. So Stasinus sounds actually quite reasonable here. You are aware that something will go bad if you're also aware that you are trying to compete with someone much better than you. You therefore desist from trying to compete with that person, and then you won't have that apprehension. In short, where there is apprehension, there also is one's sense that one is worse than somebody else, or somebody else is better than oneself. Call this reverence or shame as you like. And now back to Socrates. Ego un tuto dioferomaito poiete, eposoi hope panuge. Well then, I disagree with the poet in this. Shall I tell you where? Yes, indeed. It's also possible to translate, I disagree with this poet, but it's far less interesting. And the tuto in this is emphatically before the verb, while the poet is after the verb. It's separated. If it was just this poet, it would be tuto to poete together. Although, as I say, it is possible to understand this as I disagree with this poet. Euthyphro is eager to hear where Socrates disagrees with the poet, probably because it means he doesn't have to do any work. Socrates explains, "U dokeboi enai hina deos enthekai eidos." It doesn't seem to me to be that where there is apprehension, there also is reverence. So this is the part of the sentence which Socrates disagreed with. It's hardly surprising because the only other possibility was that he disagreed that someone wouldn't wish to compete with Zeus, which is highly unlikely. Socrates now goes on to explain why he disagrees with this part of what the poet said. Polloi garmoi docus kai nosus kai penias kai alla pollatoi auta de diotes de dienaimen, aides de meden tautaha de diasin, ukai soidoke panuge. For many seem to me to fear both diseases and poverty and other many such things. They fear, but do not have reverence for these things which they fear. Doesn't that seem to you too? Yes, indeed. Euthyphro answers in exactly the same words as in his previous answer. Panuge, indeed, yes. Euthyphro may well be answering without thinking too hard before he answers, but we should think a little bit. Why are these cases of apprehension different from the previous instance of apprehension? When we talk about diseases and poverty, we can be apprehensive about the future. Bad things may well happen, but the bad things may well happen not because we're planning to antagonize someone better than us. Socrates continues, "Alhinege eidos enthekai deos enai." But where there is reverence, there too is apprehension. So Socrates has reversed the two terms, and it sounds like he has a point. Whenever you feel worse than somebody else, or you think somebody else is better than you, then you have apprehension. But is this true? You would have apprehension if you're thinking about competing with that authority figure. If you want to antagonize them in some way, then you would have apprehension. Would you have apprehension if you feel protected by your authority figure, if you think that your authority figure is looking out to your benefit all the time. Socrates is clearly thinking of an antagonized authority figure. Epei estin hostis aidumenos ti pragmakai aischunomenos upe phobe taitekai dedoiken hamadoxan ponerias dedoike men un. Since there is someone who is reverencing, in other words, feeling that he's worse than an authority figure regarding a deed, and being ashamed regarding a deed, isn't that person in a state of fear and apprehension regarding the reputation of worthlessness? He is indeed in a state of apprehension. So Socrates really isn't thinking about someone who feels protected by an authority figure, but he is thinking about someone who wants to compete with an authority figure or antagonize an authority figure in some way. And then what he says is true. Wherever there is reverence, there is apprehension. In other words, wherever there is a feeling of being worse than someone else, or a feeling that someone is better than oneself, but one in any case wants to compete with that authority figure, then there is apprehension. And Socrates stresses it by talking about being actually embarrassed or ashamed by a certain deed. It's interesting that Euthyphro agrees with Socrates. He can only think of an authority figure you should fear. It's interesting that although Socrates raises the scenario of someone who has done some embarrassing deed, something to be ashamed about, and who therefore fears the authority figure, although Socrates has raised this scenario, Euthyphro doesn't see himself in this scenario. He doesn't see that he is embarrassing himself by putting his father on trial. He doesn't see that he is competing with his parent, who is his authority figure. Euthyphro, who is always quick to return the discussion to his own case, does not here remind Socrates that his family say that his prosecution of his father is disgraceful and that he has no respect for his father. It seems that Euthyphro is more apprehensive about the miasma than about antagonizing his father.